Good morning. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this service, and thank you to the team. It's a great team to be a part of. It's good to be back with you. It has been another difficult week of separation from our usual routines, the activities we enjoy, and each other. I am used to quite a bit of solitude, but it has been 4 months now. What I thought initially would be a temporary isolation for perhaps a couple of months looks like it will be with us for much longer. I have noticed that being as isolated as I have been has taken a toll on me, and yet I am blessed to be able to work from home, physically distant and at least relatively safe. Many are not so lucky. All of us need to be concerned about them. When I go to the grocery store, there are people there to help me and others get food to eat. I am extremely grateful to them. I have taken to telling them so. And I think of others who are at risk of infection, but are out there helping all of us. Many protesters, police officers, firefighters, those in the military, and many others, especially healthcare workers. The latest predictions on the spread, severity, and duration of the COVID-19 pandemic remain grim. We know the pandemic is devastating lives. What we do not know yet is how much worse it will get before it gets better. Many people have died. It is a certainty that more will. The rest of us are at risk and probably at least a little fearful. The worldwide economy has suffered dramatically, and we along with it. People are out of work, worried about how to survive economically as well as physically. In our desire to return to our usual lives, we have reopened businesses too soon and exposed ourselves to more infection and death. Dr. Fauci says it is still too early to talk about a second wave of the virus. We're still in the first one. Many of us are still isolated, as we have been. Isolation runs counter to our social nature and desire to be together. It runs counter to the interdependence we recognize and affirm in our 7th UU principle. It runs counter to what is needed for psychological health. And yet, physical isolation is what is indispensable now and for an as yet unknown time. I am concerned about the toll our physical separation is taking on all of us. More recently, I have been reminded of our increasing isolation from each other, politically and emotionally. The most recent examples of police violence against Black citizens sparked wide protests, some of which turned themselves violent. That prompted more responses from police forces, some of which included brutality and the denial of civil rights to some. We are divided from each other in so many ways, by race and ethnicity, by age, by inequality in many areas, by political party and political leanings. It is impossible to ignore that in many respects, we are living separate lives, isolated from each other. That attitudinal and emotional separation too, in addition to physical separation, makes me feel isolated, anxious, fearful, alone. Without the comma, today's sermon title, Holding It Together, says what I think we are all trying to do. Hold it together, hold our lives together, hold everything together that seems to be breaking apart. Society, our democratic institutions, the global economy, our planet, our healthcare systems, our own physical, emotional, and spiritual health, and our congregations. With the comma, this is the challenge of these days. Not just holding it together, but holding it together. Whatever it is, the disease, death, isolation, fear, anxiety, depression, economic hardship, but also hope, love, our world. Holding everything together is our best chance of holding it all together. Right now, more than usual, I've been thinking about God or the divine. So I start with the age-old cry, where is God? Where is God in this pandemic? Where is God in any trouble, hardship, or pain? For that matter, where is God in all that our life gives us? What we hold precious, as well as what we abhor. Maybe God is whatever power feels outside of ourselves, but lets us hold it together. I say that I am agnostic, but I am only agnostic if I think of God traditionally as some number of supernatural persons, as master planner, controller of the universe and our individual lives. If I think of God instead as the attributes we hope for and assign to such person or persons, as good, as love, as hope, then I see God everywhere. Then I see God in everything good, the mysterious universe we inhabit and the life we are given but did not and cannot create. I see God in the love and compassion we feel but cannot manufacture, the hope that sustains us when darkness falls. In times of trouble, I sometimes look back to the hardships those in the past have borne and overcome. Sometimes I find in their example some spark we might as well call divine that allowed them to triumph over adversity and hopelessness. Ludwig van Beethoven, the genius composer, is such an example. Beethoven did not lead a happy life, and by all accounts, he was a difficult human being to like. He was isolated all his life for many reasons. And yet, in this 250th year after his birth, he is being celebrated the world over because his music connects us perhaps more joyfully and resolutely than anyone else's. Beethoven was born on or about December 16th, 1770, in the city of Bonn in modern-day Germany. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was a mediocre court singer better known for his alcoholism than for any musical ability. But Beethoven's grandfather, godfather, and namesake, Kapellmeister Ludwig van Beethoven, was Bonn's most prominent and prosperous musician, a source of endless pride for young Beethoven. Sometime between the births of his two younger brothers, Beethoven's father began teaching Beethoven music with an extraordinary rigor and brutality that affected him for the rest of his life. Neighbors provided accounts of the small boy weeping while he played the clavier. He would stand on top of a footstool to reach the keys, his father beating him for each hesitation or mistake. On a near daily basis, Beethoven was flogged, locked in the cellar, and deprived of sleep for extra hours of practice. He studied the violin and clavier with his father, as well as taking additional lessons from organists around town. Whether in spite of or because of his father's draconian methods, Beethoven was a prodigiously talented musician from his earliest days. Beethoven, who struggled with sums and spelling his entire life, was at best an average student. Some biographers have hypothesized that he may have had mild dyslexia. By 1784, Beethoven's father's alcoholism was worsening and his voice was decaying. He was no longer able to support his family. So Beethoven, at age 14, formally requested an official appointment as assistant court organist. Despite his youth, his request was accepted, and Beethoven was put on the court payroll with a modest annual salary. Marjorie Howard says, as his father declined, Beethoven took over the role of wage earner and caretaker of the family. He also assumed his father's controlling and domineering ways. For a variety of reasons that included his crippling shyness and unfortunate physical appearance, Beethoven never married or had children. He was, however, desperately in love with a married woman named Antonie Brentano. The death of Beethoven's brother Caspar in 1815 sparked one of the great trials of his life, a painful legal struggle with his sister-in-law, Johanna, over the custody of Karl von Beethoven, his nephew and her son. The struggle stretched on for 7 years, during which both sides spewed ugly defamations at the other. In the end, Beethoven won the boy's custody, though hardly his affection. Despite his extraordinary output of beautiful music, Beethoven was lonely and frequently miserable throughout his adult life. Short-tempered, absent-minded, greedy, suspicious to the point of paranoia, Beethoven feuded with his brothers, his publishers, his housekeepers, his pupils, and his patrons. In one illustrative incident, Beethoven attempted to break a chair over the head of Prince Lichnowsky, one of his closest friends and most loyal patrons. Marjorie Howard writes that Ludwig van Beethoven was an often unpleasant and always unhappy man, notoriously unkempt, suffering from chronic diarrhea, liver disease, and depression. He lived in squalor, was once observed keeping an unemptied chamber pot under his piano. He was paranoid, certain everyone was cheating him. He failed at most relationships. And still, he wrote some of the most glorious and uplifting music in history. He was all about serving humanity. It was actual people he didn't like, says Jan Swafford, a lecturer in the English department at Tufts University, and author of the book, Beethoven, Anguish and Triumph. He was not able to respond to how others thought or viewed the world. Most people realize other people have different feelings, different ideas. He couldn't see that, says Swafford. At the same time Beethoven was composing some of his most immortal works, he was struggling to come to terms with a shocking and terrible fact, one that he tried desperately to conceal. He was going deaf. By the turn of the 19th century, when Beethoven was 30, he struggled to make out the words spoken to him in conversation. Beethoven revealed in a heart-wrenching letter in 1801 to his friend Franz Wegler, "I must confess that I lead a miserable life. For almost 2 years, I have ceased to attend any social functions, just because I find it impossible to say to people, 'I am deaf.' If I had any other profession, I might be able to cope with my infirmity, but in my profession, it is a terrible handicap." Swafford wrote that deafness led to further isolation for a man who was already depressed and had alienated his friends and relatives. At times, driven to extremes of melancholy by his affliction, Beethoven described his despair in a long and poignant note that he concealed his entire life. Dated October 6, 1802, and referred to as the Heiligenstadt Testament, it reads in part, "Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause that makes me seem that way to you. I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. Almost miraculously, despite his rapidly progressing deafness, Beethoven continued to compose at a furious pace. Beethoven died on March 26, 1827, at the age of 56, of post-hepatic cirrhosis of the liver. Beethoven's body of musical compositions stands with William Shakespeare's plays at the outer limits of human brilliance. And the fact Beethoven composed his most beautiful and extraordinary music while deaf, or very nearly so, is an almost superhuman feat of creative genius. Despite Beethoven's personal unhappiness, says Swafford, he put joy and consolation into his music with endless generosity. Howard's article says Jan Swafford's magisterial biography of Beethoven shows how the composer created beauty in the midst of suffering. But how? Beethoven's last full symphony was his monumental ninth, known as the Choral, because of its fourth and final movement, which includes 4 soloists and a full chorus. Beethoven took the text for the chorus from Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, adding a few words of his own in the beginning. Translated from the German and using the male-centered pre-inclusive language of his time, these are some of the words the chorus sings. Oh, friends, not these sounds. Let us instead strike up more pleasing and more joyful ones. Joy, 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 beautiful spark of divinity, daughter from Elysium. All men shall become brothers. Wherever your gentle wings hover, whoever has been lucky enough to become a friend to a friend, whoever has found a beloved wife, let him join our songs of praise. Yes, and anyone who can call one soul his own on this earth. Every creature drinks in joy at nature's breast, gladly, just as his sons hurtle through the glorious universe. So you, brothers, should run your course joyfully, like a conquering hero. Be embraced, you millions. This kiss is for the whole world. Brothers, above the canopy of stars must dwell a loving Father. How was it that Beethoven, whose own father was so cruel to him, could even imagine a loving father? How was it that he, who had little joy, no wife, and few friends, nevertheless wrote glorious music in praise of what was missing in his own life? Where was God for Beethoven? Where was God in his suffering, in his deafness, the lack of love in his life, his isolation? How was it that Beethoven, in spite of all his misery, was able to maintain such a noble view of life and humanity, enough to write music like his monumental Ninth Symphony that continues to inspire millions? Maybe that is where God was for Beethoven, in his ability to maintain that high view of life and humanity in spite of his personal misery. It is easy to see the spark of divinity in the man's music, but I think that divine spark is also evident in Beethoven's continued faith in humanity and the possibility of joy. Where is God for us in this time of trouble? Maybe God is whatever mysterious power allows our spirits to rise in this time of anxiety, separation, isolation, and perhaps depression. Maybe the God we crave that can save us is our own ability to love, to find beauty in each other and in what we can create, in reaching out for mutual help and comfort. Beethoven, by himself and lonely, somehow held his unhappy life together enough to compose his inspiring music. But he helps all of us now hold it together, 2.5 centuries after he was born. American violinist and conductor Marin Alsop said, "Ever since Beethoven's iconic Ninth Symphony premiered May 7th, 1824 in Vienna, it has remained arguably the most popular composition in the classical music canon, thanks largely to its final movement, the Ode to Joy." But Beethoven's music has become something much more than popular. He was proposing nothing less than a philosophy for humanity. Beethoven, the composer-philosopher, was a man who suffered more than we can imagine. And yet he maintained optimism and a sense of hope that we can admire and even envy. He believed wholeheartedly in the goodness of humanity, the power of love, joy, unity, tolerance, and peace to overcome and endure. I am convinced, Alsop writes, that we inherently know and feel these aspirations when we hear Beethoven's Ninth and are drawn to it both musically and morally. Beethoven's Ninth has become synonymous with many important political and social events over the course of the last century. In 1972, the Council of Europe adopted the prelude to the Ode to Joy as the anthem of Europe to celebrate the shared values of the member states and express the ideals of a united Europe: freedom, peace, and solidarity. In 1985, European Union leaders chose it as the official anthem of the EU. Outside Europe, the Ode has been tapped as a protest anthem, from demonstrators in Chile to the more recent Occupy Wall Street gatherings in Madrid. During the 1989 Christmas holiday, Alsop's teacher and mentor, Leonard Bernstein, conducted a version of Beethoven's Ninth at the Brandenburg Gate to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is humanity's anthem. Alsop has created a new project called All Together, a global ode to joy, marking the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth in 2020. Early during their isolation due to the COVID-19 pandemic, members of the Rotterdam Philharmonic played their separate parts of Beethoven's Ode to Joy in their homes, playing the music they and millions of us love. Electronically, the Rotterdam musicians joined their parts together and added the chorus. I leave you with that recording to lift you up, because disease is not the only thing that spreads by contagion. Joy, hope, courage, and resilience are contagious too.